When I last briefed the Council as chair of the al-Qaeda Committee in May, I spoke about the threat arising from an increasing range of heterogeneous al-Qaeda-linked or splinter groups. Since May, we have all witnessed the dramatic shift in this threat, with the brutal extremism and rapid territorial gains of two groups on the al-Qaeda sanctions list, the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, and the al-Nusra Front, ANF. The Council responded on 15 August by adopting Resolution 2170, which emphasised the role of the al-Qaeda sanctions regime in tackling the threat posed by ISIL and ANF, and called on states to strengthen measures to counter funding and recruitment for these groups. In that resolution, the Council directed the al-Qaeda sanctions monitoring team to submit to the committee in mid-November a report on the threat, including to the region posed by ISIL and ANF, their sources of arms, funding, recruitment and demographics, and to recommend additional action to address the threat. In its report, the monitoring team has noted that the threat from these groups is not new. ISIL evolved from al-Qaeda in Iraq to emerge today as a splinter group of al-Qaeda, while the ANF, the al-Nusra Front, remained a formal al-Qaeda affiliate. Both groups originated from terrorist networks founded by veterans of previous al-Qaeda-related groups in Afghanistan and elsewhere during the 1990s. Differences relating to leadership emerged in 2013, with the al-Qaeda core and the ANF formally dissociating from ISIL and its leader, al-Baghdadi, in February 2014, but both groups continued to subscribe to the underlying goals of al-Qaeda, promoting extremism and seeking to change the existing political order in the Middle East through terrorist violence to establish a state based on a widely repudiated misinterpretation of religion and to expel foreign influence. Excuse me. But while the threat is not new, the monitoring team did assess that the scale of the threat was qualitatively and quantitatively different because of the nexus between funding and the group's control over population and territory, and the thousands of foreign terrorist fighters that have joined them. Both groups pose an immediate threat to the population in territories they have seized and where they operate, as well as in neighbouring territories. Both groups have a track record of summary killings, rape and sexual violence, trafficking in women and children, targeting humanitarian workers, and kidnapping and murdering hostages for income or political messaging. Their presence fundamentally complicates efforts to forge political order in Iraq and Syria and aggravates and intensifies existing armed violence. Their extreme ideology exacerbates sectarian tensions, generating further tension in the region, while their campaign against minorities has altered the demography of Iraq and Syria. Globally, the monitoring team found that the threat derived from three strands. First, the large and diverse network of foreign terrorist fighters, numbering over 15,000 from over 80 countries and who already threaten a range of states. Second, the power of ISIL and ANF's toxic ideology and propaganda, which has set a new standard for al-Qaeda in disseminating its message. And third, their operational innovation, which is creating a mobile, transnational cadre of expert terrorists who can combine terrorist, guerrilla and conventional tactics. These three strands carry associated risks. As we have seen with previous al-Qaeda veterans, there is a high risk that these battle-hardened, radicalised recruits will transfer their skills and threaten peace and security in other countries in years to come. ISIL's propaganda is produced in greater volumes and with greater frequency than ever before, and has been modernised and digitalised, making it globally available with the potential to sustain a new wave of al-Qaeda movement activity. The monitoring team found that both ISIL and ANF have seized military assets from conventional armies, captured, diverted and traded arms with other opposition groups, and benefited from an extensive informal regional economy in arms smuggling. ISIL is particularly well armed, having seized extensive supplies of heavy weapons from the government of Iraq including manpads and high-mobility multi-purpose military vehicles, while ANF is more dependent on continuing fresh supplies of weapons and ammunition. Both are sophisticated in their use of improvised explosive devices, IEDs, and explosive remnants of war. Similarly, on finances, the monitoring team found that ISIL has been able to seize considerable assets in both Iraq and Syria and continues to benefit from a substantial continuing revenue flow from a range of sources, including the sale of oil, extortion, kidnapping for ransom, and to a lesser extent today, donations. The bulk of ISIL's funds appear to come from its control of oil fields in Iraq and Syria, oil which it sells and smuggles predominantly through tanker trucks and long-established smuggling networks, which the monitoring team assessed could raise revenue ranging from $846,000 to $1,645,000 per day. Both ISIL and ANF exploit civilian populations, extracting payments from those who pass through, conduct business in, or live in areas under their control, and raising revenue through the sale of stolen goods. There is evidence ISIL encourages looting and smuggling of antiquities from Iraq and Syria and generates revenue by taxing looters. ANF, however, lacks the same range and depth of resources and appears to rely more on external donations and kidnap for ransom. The funds generated from these illegal activities are used by groups to support their recruitment efforts and to strengthen their operational capability to carry out and organise terrorist attacks. In terms of ISIL's and ANF's recruits, the team identified three main sources: foreign terrorist fighters, local Iraqis and Syrians, and new local affiliates ranging from militia and ex-Ba'athists who have made tactical alliances with ISIL. Recruits are drawn in through internet-based platforms, personal contact and persuasion, or in some cases through prison-based networks. Despite the sharp growth in foreign terrorist fighters in the last 3 years, the monitoring team found no specific typology for a foreign terrorist fighter, but more data was emerging. What can be said is that this new wave tends to be younger, more diverse, and digital savvy, which in turn generates fresh social and operational networks that are more transnational. Fighters came, as we've said, from over 80 countries, with large groupings from the Maghreb and Middle East, along with Europe and Central Asia. There was also evidence of a significant presence of dual nationals with European passports. As directed in Resolution 2170, adopted in August, the monitoring team has made a number of detailed recommendations which the committee, the al-Qaeda Committee, is now considering. The monitoring team recommends that the committee promote fuller implementation and greater use of the existing al-Qaeda sanctions regime by encouraging states to identify more designations to the committee relevant to ISIL and ANF, and encouraging the availability of technical assistance and capacity building to address gaps in implementation in collaboration with the Counter-Terrorism Committee and its Executive Directorate. The monitoring team also recommends a number of measures requiring Council action designed to stem the flow of funds to ISIL and ANF from the sale of oil from territory they control, but also to tackle potential revenue streams such as from looted antiquities and to prevent possible avenues for resupply in ISIL and ANF-controlled territory by banning flights to or from such territory. The team also recommends a specific focus on heightened vigilance in the banking sector against ISIL and ANF. Should such measures be adopted, the team also recommends the committee assess the impact of such measures after 6 months to ensure they affect only their target. Lastly, the monitoring team recommends member states use Interpol's network and tools, such as the Transnational Fighters Database, to share information on known and suspected foreign terrorist fighters, and highlights the need for more concerted multilateral and national action to address the toxic ideas and the toxic imagery promoted by ISIL, ANF, and other groups within the al-Qaeda movement. Effectively implemented, well-targeted al-Qaeda sanctions can make a real contribution to disrupting ISIL and ANF and inhibiting their international network of recruits and facilitators, but sanctions alone clearly are not sufficient. A comprehensive approach is needed that properly integrates UN strategies with multilateral and national action and incorporates strategic communication to counter the terrorist narrative. Thank you, Madam President.
For his comprehensive briefing. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Raimondo Murmukaiti, Chair of the Security Council Committee, established pursuant to Resolution 1373/2001 concerning counter-terrorism.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to start by thanking the Australian Presidency for providing me with this timely and very important opportunity to brief the Security Council on the Counter-Terrorism Committee's efforts pursuant to Council's Resolution 2178/2014. I'd like to recall that the committee, with the support of its Executive Directorate, CTED, is mandated by this resolution to identify gaps in Member States' capacities to implement Security Council Resolutions 1373/2001 and 1624/2005 that may hinder states' ability to stem the flow of foreign terrorist fighters, identify good practices in states' implementation efforts, and facilitate the necessary technical assistance to fill implementation gaps. While implementing its mandate, the committee, with the support of CTED, has prepared a preliminary analysis of the principal implementation gaps. This non-state-specific analysis will be issued as a document of the Security Council under the symbol S 2014-807. Allow me to highlight some of the key findings of this analysis. With regard to the legal framework, states must determine whether their laws criminalize specific FTF-related acts in accordance with Resolution 2178/2014. Operative paragraph 6. Our preliminary analysis indicates that although many states have introduced, pursuant to Resolution 1373/2001, comprehensive legislation that could be transposed to meet the challenges of FTFs, others do not have adequate legislation in this respect. Some states, for example, do not yet adequately criminalize the broad range of preparatory acts related to FTFs, including acts aimed at facilitating the travel of FTFs, as well as travel by FTFs through their territories in transit for the purpose of committing terrorist acts in other states. It is also evident that bringing FTFs to justice faces significant practical challenges. Many states lack the capacity needed to ensure that individuals participating in FTF-related activities are brought to justice through effective prosecution in accordance with Resolution 1373/2001 and 2178/2014. Among other things, the committee's ongoing dialogue with states has revealed difficulties in obtaining evidence from other countries, whether of origin, transit, or destination, and has shown that few FTFs reveal their plans before leaving. International judicial cooperation on the matter needs to be stepped up and made more effective. Gaps also continue to exist in arrangements and mechanisms relating to extradition. On the law enforcement side, the Resolution 1373/2001 requires states to take the necessary steps to prevent the commission of terrorist acts. Many states, however, lack adequate capacities to monitor communications through special investigative techniques and other lawful methods in implementing this preventive aspect. Gaps exist also in the international exchange of information by law enforcement and intelligence agencies aimed at preventing the commission of terrorist acts and bringing terrorists, including FTFs, to justice, including by provision of early warning to other states by exchange of information. This form of information exchange can be vital to countering the FTF threat and needs to be enhanced. Significant gaps remain in Member States' implementation of the border control provisions of Resolution 1373/2001 and 1624/2005. The lack of relevant information and analytical capability at border crossing hampers states' ability to detect and prevent the movement of FTFs. Many states are either inadequately connected to or do not fully exploit the databases of Interpol. Controls on the issuance of identity papers and travel documents, measures to prevent counterfeiting, forgery, or fraudulent use of identity papers and travel documents are also lagging, for a variety of reasons, including a lack of effective mechanisms for implementing related requirements. The porous and lengthy nature of many land borders, including those of states most affected by the FTF phenomenon, also continues to increase state vulnerabilities. When it comes to preventing and disrupting the terrorist financing, many states have yet to ensure, pursuant to Resolution 1373/2001, that their legal frameworks include criminalization of terrorist financing or to establish mechanisms for the freezing of terrorist assets without delay. Ability to effectively identify and prevent the illicit cross-border movement of cash and to regulate alternative remittances needs to be addressed with greater urgency. States also need to work actively with the private sector and non-profit organizations to provide guidance on how best to protect financial flows from being diverted to terrorist uses. Perhaps the most critical gap in states' capacities is the inadequate sharing of comprehensive, useful, and timely financial information by domestic law enforcement and intelligence partners or by national agencies and their international counterparts. Countering incitement to terrorism and providing effective and calibrated counter-narrative is key to tackling violent extremism, which can be conducive to terrorism. The emphasis on its importance is one of the most novel aspects of Resolution 2178, which is also of relevance in the context of Resolution 1624. Some states have not yet taken adequate steps to initiate community engagement programs or to develop strategies for effectively conveying targeted counter messages aimed at specific groups that may be vulnerable to radicalization and a spread of violent extremism. There are also gaps in states' efforts to counter the use of information and communication technologies, including the Internet, by terrorists and their supporters to incite terrorist acts and encourage support and sympathy for the terrorist groups. Another important gap in many states is the lack of effective strategies and programs for the rehabilitation and reintegration of returning FTFs. The development of such strategies and programs is a specific requirement of Resolution 2178, which also requires states to adopt prosecutorial strategies to hold FTF accountable for terrorist acts while assessing whether alternative means exist to better facilitate their rehabilitation and reintegration. Finally, there continue to be significant gaps in states' efforts to ensure compliance with their obligations under international law, including international human rights law, international refugee law, and international humanitarian law in the context of counterterrorism measures taken to implement Resolution 1373 and 1624, and this may foreshadow similar gaps in the implementation of Resolution 2178. Respect for human rights, fundamental freedoms, and the rule of law are complementary and mutually reinforcing with effective counterterrorism measures and are an essential part of a successful counterterrorism effort. Failure by states to comply with these and other international obligations, including under the Charter of the United Nations, is one of the factors contributing to increased radicalization and fosters a sense of impunity. At a backdrop of the new challenges of terrorism, the Committee is aware of the fact that increasingly more countries are recognizing the grave threat posed by the global nature of FTFs. In this regard, counterterrorism actions and measures are either being considered, reviewed, or undertaken by states to address the FTF phenomena, as well as on countering violent extremism, which can be conducive to terrorism. This opens new dimensions and possibilities for international cooperation. The Committee, with the support of CTED, will continue to develop and deepen the analysis of states' gaps and assistance needs with regard to the implementation of Resolutions 1373 and 1624, which will help states to comply with Resolution 2178, and in doing so, will build on CTED's unique knowledge base with regards to country-specific, regional, and global assessments of states' implementation of Resolutions 1373 and 1624. It will also continue to compile good practices and make recommendations to states to strengthen their counterterrorism programs and will continue to count upon key partners in these endeavors. Ultimately, the facilitation of technical assistance is a core aspect of the mandate conveyed by the Resolution 2178. The Committee and CTED will underpin their technical assistance facilitation work by specific efforts and approaches to address the FTF phenomenon based on a gaps analysis. This will include working with states at their request on the development of comprehensive counterterrorism strategies. In terms of delivery of technical assistance, other players, both within and outside the UN system, such as those of UNCCT and other entities under CTITF framework and donor states of GCTF, are of paramount importance. The Committee and CTED will continue to explore effective ways and approaches in achieving the objectives of counterterrorism capacity building. The committee looks forward to future opportunities for updating the Security Council and wider membership on its efforts pursuant to Resolution 2178. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank Her Excellency Ms Murmukaiti for her detailed and insightful briefing. The Council has before it the text of a statement by the President on behalf of the Council on the subject of today's meeting. I thank the Council members for their valuable contributions to this statement. In accordance with the understanding reached among members of the Council, I shall take it that the members of the Security Council agree to the statement, which will be issued as a document of the Security Council under the symbol SPRST 2014-23. It is so decided. It is now my privilege to make a statement in my capacity as the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Australia. For Australia, there is no more pressing matter of national and international security than reducing the threat from terrorism. The threat from ISIL or Daesh, al-Nusra Front and other al-Qaeda affiliated groups is more dangerous, more global and more diversified than ever before. Terrorists are younger, more violent, more innovative and highly interconnected. They are masters of social media to terrorise and to recruit and are very tech savvy. They incite each other. They communicate their propaganda and violence directly into our homes to recruit disaffected young men and women. Young people like a 17-year-old from Melbourne who grew up in a typical Australian household and played sport for his local high school. Recently, he travelled to Iraq and detonated his explosives vest in a suicide bomb attack in a Baghdad marketplace, injuring more than 90 people. Young people like the three brothers from Brisbane. One became Australia's first known suicide bomber, killing himself and 35 others at a military checkpoint in Syria. The second is currently fighting with al-Nusra. The third was stopped by Australian authorities before he got on a plane to join them. Australians are rightly outraged. We have turned our outrage into action. We are committed to working with the Iraqi government, the United States and over 30 partners to attack and degrade ISIL and take back Iraqi territory. We are currently conducting airstrikes against ISIL and providing special forces to help build the capabilities of Iraqi security forces and others fighting ISIL. I met recently with Prime Minister al-Abadi in Baghdad. He expressed deep gratitude for the assistance of Australia and other nations joined in the fight against the brutalisation of his citizens by ISIL. I conveyed to him Australia's strong support for Iraq and our determination to stop Australian terrorist fighters from adding to the suffering of the people of Iraq and neighbouring Syria. We are taking necessary steps at home. The Australian government has cancelled the passports of more than 70 Australians suspected of planning to commit a terrorist act or engage in politically motivated violence overseas. Australia already has in place sophisticated legal architecture to effectively counter terrorism, including enabling us to implement those obligations on all member states under Security Council Resolution 1373. I used these existing laws last week to freeze the assets of 2 Australians who were recruiting for ISIL online. The Australian government has now introduced new foreign fighter laws to help disrupt the organisation, financing and facilitation of foreign terrorist fighters by enhancing our ability to track financial transactions of suspected foreign terrorist fighters, lowering the threshold for arrest without warrant for terrorism offences, which will enable our agencies to disrupt terrorist activity at an earlier stage, and cancelling social welfare payments to cut off the diversion of such funds for terrorism. These new laws will enable us to stop suspected foreign terrorist fighters before they board a plane by allowing us to suspend, as well as cancel, a person's Australian passport, and enhancing screening and security measures at international airports, including through the collection and matching of biometric data. These laws will enhance our ability to investigate and prosecute foreign terrorist fighters by introducing a new, broader offence for advocating terrorism, introducing a new offence for entering or remaining in designated areas overseas where terrorist organisations are fighting without a legitimate reason, amending the terrorist organisation listing provision to include the promotion and encouragement of terrorist acts, requiring that the prosecution must prove that a person intended to engage in a hostile activity in any foreign country rather than a particular foreign country, allowing courts greater flexibility in determining whether to admit as evidence material obtained from overseas in terrorism-related proceedings. This is a significant development and will rely on good information sharing with member states. Requiring telecommunications companies to retain metadata, enhancing Australia's capacity to track, investigate and prosecute foreign terrorist fighters and supporters of terrorism. These laws will also enhance our ability to manage the threat from returned foreign terrorist fighters by enabling our police to more easily seek control orders on returning foreign terrorist fighters and broadening the grounds on which such control orders can be sought. Australia is a vibrant democracy, so, as it should, this package of legislation has generated a vigorous national debate on the need to protect individual rights of Australians, including their right to privacy. Australia is preserving these rights by increasing support for independent oversight. We will also expand our regional law enforcement capacity building efforts. Australia will host a major global counter-terrorism forum conference in December on air passenger security to help governments use Interpol databases and implement the United Nations al-Qaeda sanctions to prevent international travel by foreign terrorist fighters. We are working with Interpol to deliver training in our region on the use of technology by terrorists and how electronic evidence is gathered, managed and used in terrorism prosecutions. As President of the Financial Action Task Force for the next year, Australia will ensure that the task force will act to cut off funding to terrorist groups and foreign terrorist fighters. A crucial pillar to the Australian approach is to work directly with our communities. It seems to us that the very best way to build resistance to radicalisation is through well-informed families, schools, and religious and local institutions that can influence those at risk to dissuade them from embracing violent extremism. We are building targeted early intervention and counter-radicalisation programs to identify the most at-risk individuals and work with them through mentoring, education and employment support and counselling. We must also involve women and girls, and we have developed leadership training courses with them to help build community resilience. We are working with the ICT sector to reduce the risk posed by terrorists and extremist groups online through education, promoting alternative messages and removing extremist content. ISIL and its ilk are an affront to Islam. All of us, including Muslim communities themselves, must do more to negate the violent extremist narratives of terrorists and denounce radical preachers of hate in our midst. The international community must join with them, and the United Nations is uniquely placed to provide leadership. The hateful ideologies are an affront to the values of the United Nations Charter. We believe that a United Nations envoy should be appointed to build a coherent, coordinated and strategic message to counter the spread of violent extremism and provide much needed guidance to states, include through building their capacity to combat terrorism. Every country has an obligation to prevent terrorism. Every country has an obligation not to export terrorist capabilities. Each one has a responsibility to degrade the resources of terrorist organisations and to prevent the spread of their evil propaganda. Resolutions 2170 and 2178 enhance our framework to do this. But the road to effective implementation requires sustained effort, unwavering commitment and enduring cooperation between states. Today's presidential statement builds on these resolutions. It identifies practical next steps to stop the recruitment and travel of foreign terrorist fighters, to ensure that there's no place for their toxic ideologies in our communities, and to disrupt each and every terrorist organisation's funding sources. This statement reaffirms the international community's unflinching resolve. We must starve terrorist organisations of fighters, funding and legitimacy. We must act decisively and together. I resume my function